Blood flowed down the stony bank of the River Avon, staining crimson the crystal-clear waters that Dorothy had known since childhood. She dropped the basket of wet clothes to the ground, her heart racing as she spotted the motionless body among the reeds. For a terrible instant she thought it was a corpse, but then she heard a low, desperate moan. "Lord in heaven," she murmured, lifting her skirts to approach cautiously. The man lay face down, his navy blue tailcoat torn and bloody, his tangled brown hair matted to his sweaty forehead. She couldn't discern his age or features, but from the quality of the fabric and the golden buttons, he was certainly no common peasant. Dorothy looked around, searching for signs of other injured individuals or of the brigands who had perpetrated such a barbarity. The silence of the autumn morning of 1847 was broken only by the murmur of the current and the almost inaudible groans of the stranger. There was no time to lose. The man was losing an alarming amount of blood. "Sir? Can you hear me?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. Gently, she touched his shoulder. His skin was cold and damp, but there was still life in that broken body. He turned his head slightly, revealing a face that, even disfigured by cuts and bruises, possessed noble features. His lips moved in an attempt to speak, but only a guttural sound escaped. "Don't try to speak now," Dorothy said, removing the wool shawl that covered her shoulders. "I need to get you to a safe place." She was a small woman, but years of washing clothes in the river had strengthened her arms and hands. Still, it would be almost impossible to carry a man of his size to her modest home on the outskirts of Bath. She looked around again, this time searching for something that could help her. The wicker basket. It was large and sturdy enough. Quickly she emptied it of the wet clothes and with considerable effort managed to roll the man's body into it. He lost consciousness during the process, which was perhaps a blessing considering the pain he must have been feeling. The walk to her house seemed endless. Dorothy stopped every few meters to catch her breath, her hands already sore from the scrapes the basket's wicker caused on her delicate skin. Some neighbors watched her from their windows with curiosity, but no one offered help. It was better that way. Fewer questions would be asked. Her house consisted of only 2 small rooms. The main room, where the fireplace, a crude table, and 2 chairs were located, and the back bedroom, where there was a narrow bed and a chest where she kept her few belongings. Dorothy decided to accommodate him in the main room near the fire. It would be warmer, and she could watch over him better during the night. With great difficulty, she managed to transfer him from the basket to a pile of blankets spread on the floor. Then, she lit the fire and put water on to boil. She would need to clean the wounds before they became infected. She had learned some basic nursing care from old Martha, who had tended to the poor of the region before passing away the previous winter. When she began to remove his clothes, Dorothy felt her cheeks flush. She had never seen a man unclothed, and even in the current circumstances, she felt awkward. But necessity overcame modesty. The tailcoat was so bloody and torn that she had to cut it with her sewing scissors. Underneath, his fine linen shirt was also ruined. The wounds were extensive, but, fortunately, did not appear fatal. A deep gash on his left arm, several smaller cuts on his chest and back, and a purple bruise that stretched from his ribs to his hip. Someone had beaten him with considerable violence, probably looking for money or valuables. As she carefully cleaned each wound with warm water, Dorothy observed other details that confirmed her suspicions about the stranger's social origin. His hands were smooth, without the calluses that marked those accustomed to manual labor. His nails were well kept despite the current grime. His teeth, which she could glimpse when he moaned during a more painful procedure, were white and even, a rare luxury among the poor. "Who are you?" she murmured, applying a homemade herbal ointment to the cuts. "And what were you doing alone on such a dangerous road?" Brigands had become a growing problem in the vicinity of Bath. The prosperity of the city, famous for its thermal waters, and the elegant society that frequented it, also attracted less desirable elements. Many travelers were robbed on the roads leading to the city, especially those traveling with little or no escort. When she finished tending to his wounds, Dorothy covered the man with her best blankets and prepared a light soup in case he awoke hungry. Then she sat in a nearby chair to watch over him. The light of dusk filtered through the small window, painting the room in golden hues. It was at that moment that he opened his eyes for the first time since she had found him. Dorothy leaned forward immediately, placing her hand on his forehead. The fever had subsided, which was a good sign. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. He gazed at her for a few seconds, as if trying to comprehend where he was and who this woman with brown hair and kind eyes, watching him with concern, might be. His voice, when it finally emerged, was hoarse and weak. Where am I?" "Safe," Dorothy replied. "I found you injured near the river. I brought you to my house." He tried to sit up, but she gently stopped him. "Don't move yet. Your injuries are serious and you've lost a lot of blood. The men, they took—" His voice trailed off. "Rest now. We can talk when you're stronger." During the following minutes, Dorothy watched him struggle against unconsciousness. There was something in his eyes, a depth, an intelligence that intrigued her. He was not merely a common nobleman who had fallen victim to robbers. There was a mystery about that man, secrets she intuited but couldn't decipher. "What should I call you?" she asked when he seemed more alert. A long pause. Dorothy noticed his hesitation, as if he were carefully weighing his answer. "John," he finally said. "Just John." She nodded, although she knew it wasn't his real name. A man with such fine clothes, with that bearing and way of speaking, certainly possessed a more elaborate name and title. But if he preferred to keep his identity a secret, she would respect that. After all, perhaps he feared his attackers would return to finish the job. "Very well, John. I am Dorothy Whitmore. This is my house, and you are safe here." Something passed through his eyes when he heard her name. Surprise. Recognition? Before she could analyze it further, he had closed his eyes again, exhausted by the effort of conversation. Dorothy remained awake for most of the night, checking his breathing and changing the bandages when necessary. She had made a decision that could change her life forever. She would care for that stranger until he fully recovered. No matter how long it took or what questions it might raise in the neighborhood, she did not imagine that the man she had saved from the waters of the Avon harbored secrets. That would soon transform her simple existence into a plot worthy of the novels she sometimes overheard high society ladies discussing at the market. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the window as Dorothy awoke in the chair, her neck aching from the uncomfortable position in which she had slept. Immediately her eyes turned to the man lying near the fireplace. John, if that was indeed his name, was breathing more regularly, though he still looked pale in the morning light. She rose silently and approached to check the bandages. During the night, she had woken twice upon hearing him murmur incomprehensible words, as if he were reliving the assault in nightmares. Once, distinctly, she had heard him say something about the documents and London, but she hadn't been able to understand the rest. "Good morning," a hoarse voice said behind her. Dorothy turned, surprised to find John awake and watching her with clearer eyes than the previous night. The fever had clearly subsided, and for the first time she could fully appreciate his features. He was an attractive man, likely in his 30s, with aristocratic features that confirmed her initial suspicions. "How do you feel this morning?" she asked, kneeling beside him with a basin of fresh water. "Better, thanks to your care." He tried to sit up, but she gently stopped him. "Please, allow me at least to thank you properly for saving my life." Dorothy felt the heat rise to her cheeks. There was something in the way he spoke, a perfect diction, a refined accent, that made her even more aware of her own humble origin. "There's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." "I'm afraid not, Miss Dorothy. Not everyone possesses a heart as generous as yours." She began to change the bandages, noting with satisfaction that the wounds were no longer bleeding. Her hands worked deftly, but she felt his eyes watching every movement. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked softly. "Only if you feel comfortable, of course." John remained silent for a long moment, as if carefully weighing his words. "I was traveling from London to Bath when I was attacked by 3 masked men. They appeared out of nowhere, brought down my horse and—" He paused, passing a hand over his forehead. "They took everything. My luggage, my documents, my purse. You were traveling alone? Dorothy couldn't hide her surprise. A man of his evident social standing would rarely travel without an escort. Yes, Again that hesitation. I prefer to travel discreetly. It's more convenient for my business. Dorothy nodded, though the explanation didn't completely satisfy her. There was something evasive in the way he answered, as if each word were carefully selected. But she would respect his privacy. Perhaps he was a prosperous merchant who preferred not to flaunt his wealth, or a lawyer dealing with delicate matters. I need to send word to London, he said suddenly. There are people who will be worried about my disappearance, of course. But first you need to regain your strength. You've lost a lot of blood, and your wounds are still tender. During the days that followed, Dorothy established a routine. In the morning, she prepared a simple meal: oatmeal porridge, fresh bread when she could buy it, sometimes eggs from her chickens. John ate with increasing appetite, which she considered a good sign. In the afternoon, when he felt stronger, they would talk. Dorothy discovered that he was surprisingly cultured, familiar with literature, politics, and worldly affairs of which she had only vaguely heard. He would ask her about her life, showing genuine interest in her stories about working by the river and life in the small community around Bath. Have you always lived here? He asked one afternoon as she mended one of her own garments near the window. I was born here. My parents passed away when I was 16. Consumption took both of them in the same winter. Since then, I've supported myself by washing clothes for the town's families. Do you have no other relatives? No, or at least none who care. She smiled sadly. But I don't complain. I have a roof over my head, food, and honest work. It's more than many can say. John observed her with an expression she couldn't interpret. There was something in his eyes, admiration. Pity? Curiosity? Before she could analyze it further, he looked away. It's an admirable life, he said softly. There is nobility in honest independence. During the third night, Dorothy was awakened by groans coming from the main room. She found John thrashing in the blankets, clearly in the midst of a nightmare. Sweat covered his forehead and he murmured disconnected words. They can't know. The contracts. The merger with Baring Brothers. Dorothy gently woke him, but the words kept echoing in her mind. Baring Brothers was one of London's most important banks. She knew that even with her limited education. What kind of business did John conduct that connected him to such institutions? The next morning he seemed uncomfortable, as if he knew he had spoken too much in his sleep. Forgive me if I disturbed you during the night, he said, avoiding her eyes. Nightmares are natural after a traumatic experience, she replied diplomatically, though curiosity consumed her. It was that day that John insisted on helping her with small tasks. Despite her protests, he got up, still unsteady, but determined. I cannot remain useless while you work to support me. Dorothy watched him with skepticism. A man with soft hands would hardly be useful with household chores, but, to her surprise, John proved to be more capable than she had expected. He lit the fire efficiently, carried buckets of water, and even helped prepare the meal. Where did you learn these skills? She asked, genuinely intrigued. Well, when I was young I spent time in the countryside, with distant relatives. Another evasive answer, Dorothy noted. As the days passed, she began to notice small details that didn't align with John's story. Despite his hands showing no calluses from manual labor, he demonstrated surprising knowledge of household management. Once seeing her struggling with monthly bills, he offered to help and quickly organized her finances with impressive mathematical precision. You have a knack for numbers, she commented. My business requires a certain aptitude in that area. But it was more than aptitude, it was mastery. Dorothy had known prosperous merchants in Bath, and none of them possessed that instinctive ability to handle complex figures. One morning, returning from the market, she found John standing by the window, observing the street with a thoughtful expression. He had shaved with the razor she had managed to borrow from Mr. Patterson, the neighbor, and was wearing clean clothes she had washed and mended. Even with the bandages still visible and the marks of the beating in the process of healing, it was impossible to deny his imposing presence. Do you feel better? She asked. Much better. In fact, he turned to her with determination. I believe I have sufficiently abused your hospitality. I need to leave soon. Dorothy felt something collapse in her chest. During those days, she had grown accustomed to his company, to their intelligent conversations, to the feeling of not being completely alone. More than that, though she dared not admit it even to herself, she had developed feelings that went beyond Christian compassion. Your wounds haven't completely healed yet, she protested. They are well enough for the journey, and there are matters in London that cannot wait any longer. That night, Dorothy lay in her narrow bed, but sleep did not come. She knew John would leave soon, and her life would return to its usual solitary routine. She tried to convince herself that it was better this way. He clearly belonged to a different world than hers, and prolonging his stay would only make the inevitable separation more painful, but a part of her desperately wished he would stay, even knowing it was impossible. Men like John, be they prosperous merchants or minor gentry, did not remain in humble cottages with orphan washerwomen. What she couldn't imagine was that, in the next room, John also lay awake, wrestling with dilemmas that went far beyond simple physical injuries or business obligations. Dorothy awoke the next morning with a strange sensation that something had changed during the night. The house seemed quieter than usual, and a different light filtered through her bedroom window. Upon rising and heading to the main room, she found John already awake, sitting at the table with an upright posture that contrasted drastically with the fragility of the previous days. There was something different about him, a determination that seemed to have solidified during the night. His wounds, though still visible, clearly no longer prevented him from moving with ease. Indeed, for the first time since his arrival, he seemed completely self-possessed. "Good morning, Dorothy," he said, turning as he heard her approach. "I hope you slept well." "Perfectly, thank you." She noticed that he had not only lit the fire but also prepared breakfast with a competence that surprised her. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself. On the contrary, after all you've done for me, it's the least I can do." He paused, as if carefully weighing his next words. "In fact, there's something I need to discuss with you." Dorothy felt her heart quicken. From the seriousness of his tone, she knew it was about the subject they had both avoided, his imminent departure. They sat down for breakfast, but she could barely touch her food. John, on the other hand, ate with the appetite of a man fully recovered, though his eyes occasionally darted to her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "John," she finally said, unable to bear the tension, "if you need to leave, I understand perfectly. I know you have obligations in London?" "Yes, I do." He set down his utensils and looked at her directly. "But before I leave, I would like to do something for you. As a token of gratitude for the care you've given me." Dorothy immediately felt uncomfortable. "It's not necessary. I only did what any decent person would do. We've discussed this before, and I believe we both know it's not true." He leaned forward, his voice taking on an intensity that made her pay full attention. "How many people passed by that road in the days following the attack? How many could have seen me and simply walked on?" Dorothy didn't answer because she knew he was right. In the days that followed, several people had passed by the spot. She herself had seen the footprints in the mud when she returned to the river to work. "Allow me to be specific," John continued. "I would like to leave enough money for you to live comfortably for a few months, without the need to work by the river during the harsh winter." "Absolutely not." Dorothy stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over her cup. "I do not accept charity. It's not charity. It's fair payment for the medical care and lodging I received." "Medical care?" Dorothy couldn't help a bitter laugh. "I am a washerwoman, not a trained nurse. I did only what I could with herbs and common sense." John also stood, coming around the table to stand closer to her. "Dorothy, look at me." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. There was something in his expression, an almost solemn seriousness, that prevented her from looking away. "When you found me on that bank, I was dying. There is no dramatism in that statement. It is a medical fact. I had lost too much blood and remained exposed to the elements for too long. Without your care, I would not have survived until nightfall. Anyone." "No." His voice was firm, almost authoritative. Not just anyone would have the competence to treat wounds like mine. Not just anyone would have the patience to watch over me during feverish nights. And certainly not just anyone would have the kindness to care for a stranger without asking inconvenient questions about his identity or circumstances. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes. There was truth in his words, but accepting money would make her feel as though she had cared for him out of self-interest. "If you give me money," she said softly, "all of this becomes a commercial transaction." And it wasn't that, at least not for me. John's expression softened immediately. He extended his hand as if to touch her, but stopped halfway, leaving it suspended in the air between them. "You are right," he said after a moment. "Forgive me. It was not my intention to diminish the genuine nature of your generosity." Dorothy nodded, feeling simultaneously relieved and strangely disappointed. A part of her, a part she didn't want to acknowledge, secretly wished he would find a reason to prolong his stay. "But," John continued, "there is another matter I must mention. During my recovery here, I couldn't help but notice certain difficulties in your situation." "What kind of difficulties?" Dorothy asked defensively. "The roof has leaks that need to be repaired before winter. The back door doesn't close properly. And yesterday, when I helped you with the monthly accounts, I noticed that your earnings barely cover your basic needs." Dorothy felt her face flush with shame. She had no idea he had observed her situation with such close attention to detail. "I have managed very well on my own until now." "Yes, and that is admirable. But there is no dishonor in accepting help when offered sincerely." John paused, as if carefully choosing his words. "What if, instead of direct money, I arranged for the necessary repairs? I would hire local craftsmen, pay for the materials. You would not receive money directly, just a safer and more comfortable home." Dorothy hesitated. The offer was tempting, especially with winter approaching. The leaks in the roof had worsened significantly during the last rains, and she had no means to afford proper repairs. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because—" John paused, and for the first time since she had known him, he seemed genuinely uncertain how to proceed. "Because the idea of leaving, knowing you will spend the winter in a house with leaks, is unbearable to me." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that contrasted with his usual composure, that touched Dorothy deeply. She realized that, behind his careful facade, John was a man with an active conscience and a generous heart. "Very well," she said finally. "But only the essential repairs. Nothing extravagant." The relief in his expression was unmistakable. "Naturally. Only what is necessary to make the house safe and habitable for the winter." For the rest of the morning, John left to make arrangements in town. Dorothy used the time alone to reflect on the events of the past few days and on the confusing feelings that had been growing in her heart. She had fallen in love with him. The admission came with painful clarity as she worked mechanically through her household chores. It wasn't just gratitude for his company or admiration for his good manners. It was something deeper and more dangerous, a genuine affection for the man she had come to know behind the formal courtesy and careful evasions, but she also knew that such a feeling was futile and potentially destructive. John clearly belonged to a world different from her own. His knowledge, his manners, his evident education, everything pointed to a social standing that made any relationship between them impossible. When he returned at midday, he brought with him a middle-aged man who introduced himself as Mr. Hendricks, the local carpenter. "With your permission," John said, "I would like Mr. Hendricks to assess the necessary repairs." For the next hour, Dorothy watched as the two men methodically examined her small house. Hendricks noted each problem on a growing list, while John asked specific questions that demonstrated surprising knowledge of property construction and maintenance. "Where did you learn so much about home repairs?" Dorothy asked when Hendricks left to fetch materials. "I've managed some rural properties in my business," John replied. "One learns to identify problems before they become expensive to fix." Another evasive answer, but Dorothy was beginning to accept that John kept secrets for reasons that were likely legitimate. Her trust in him had grown over the days, based not on his words, but on his consistent actions and demonstrated character. In the afternoon, while Hendricks and an assistant worked on the roof. John insisted on helping Dorothy with her usual chores. Together they washed clothes in the yard, and Dorothy couldn't help but notice how quickly he had adapted to manual labor. "Don't you miss your usual activities?" she asked. "Your business in London must be neglected." "I have competent partners who can manage affairs in my absence for a few days," he replied. "And honestly, these have been some of the most peaceful days I can recall in a long time." "Peaceful?" Dorothy laughed. "Being injured and recovering in a strange house seems peaceful to you?" John stopped scrubbing the laundry in his hands and looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "There are different kinds of injuries, Dorothy. Some physical, others not. Sometimes healing requires not just medicine and rest, but also the company of genuinely good people." Dorothy felt her heart quicken at the implications of his words. Was he suggesting that her presence had provided some kind of emotional healing beyond the physical? "You speak like someone who carries heavy burdens," she observed softly. "We all carry burdens. Yours are no less significant than mine, but mine are simple. Work, survival, occasional loneliness. Yours seem to be of a different nature." John remained silent for a long moment, as if wrestling with an internal decision. Finally, he said, "Sometimes, Dorothy, having much can be as isolating as having little. Wealth and social standing can create walls as effective as poverty, just of a different nature." It was the closest confession he had made about his true situation, and Dorothy felt a wave of tenderness for this man who clearly wrestled with dilemmas far beyond the practical hardships of her own life. As the afternoon wore on, and the work on the roof was completed,
Hendricks presented his bill to John. Dorothy watched discreetly as John paid without hesitation and with a generosity that confirmed her suspicions about his true financial situation.
No modest tradesman would pay for household repairs with such nonchalance. That evening, as they prepared for what both knew would likely be their last meal together, Dorothy fought against the urge to ask when exactly he would leave. The question hung between them like a threatening cloud, but neither seemed willing to address it directly. Morning arrived with a thick mist that seemed to mirror the growing melancholy in Dorothy's heart. She awoke knowing, without anyone needing to say, that this would be John's last day in her home. There was something in the quality of the silence, in the way the light filtered through the window, that carried the weight of impending farewell. As she made her way to the main room, she found him already awake, standing by the window, observing the small garden where they had worked together in the previous days. His posture was erect, resolute, but Dorothy noticed a tension in his shoulders she hadn't observed before. "Good morning," she said softly, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the knot she felt in her throat. John turned, and she immediately saw that he, too, had slept little. There were dark circles under his eyes, and an expression of determination that seemed to have solidified overnight. "Dorothy." He inclined his head slightly. "Did you sleep well?" "Perfectly," she lied, approaching the fireplace to light the fire. Her hands trembled slightly, and she hoped he wouldn't notice. "Allow me." John quickly approached, taking the match from her hands. His fingers brushed hers briefly, and Dorothy felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the morning chill. They worked in silence to prepare breakfast, each lost in thoughts they dared not verbalize. Dorothy watched discreetly as John moved about the small kitchen with a familiarity that made her question what her life would be like after he left. In just 1 week, he had become an integral part of her daily routine. "There is something I must tell you," John said finally, as they sat at the table. His voice carried a solemnity that made Dorothy lift her eyes from her barely touched plate. "I leave this afternoon." Although she had expected these words, hearing them spoken aloud struck Dorothy like a physical blow. She nodded, unable to trust her own voice. "There are matters in London that can no longer wait," he continued, his words carefully controlled. "People who depend on my decisions, businesses that require my immediate presence." "I understand perfectly," Dorothy managed to say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Your wounds have healed well. You are ready for the journey." For a moment, both remained silent, the food growing cold on their plates as each wrestled with emotions they could not adequately express. Dorothy, John said softly, leaning forward, you must know that these days here have been extraordinary for me. Your kindness, your generosity, the way you cared for a stranger without asking inconvenient questions, this has restored my faith in human nature in ways I cannot adequately express. Dorothy felt tears prick her eyes, but forced herself to maintain composure. I only did what any decent person would do. No. His voice was firm, almost vehement. I have known many people in my life, Dorothy. People from all social classes, from all backgrounds. I can state categorically that very few possess a heart as genuinely generous as yours. There was something in his tone, a deep conviction mingled with what seemed to be genuine regret, that made Dorothy question his true identity again. What kind of life did he lead that allowed him to make such broad comparisons about human nature? There is something else, John continued, his hand moving as if to reach for hers, but stopping halfway across the table. I would like to leave you a way to contact me. Should you need anything at all, I want you to know you can reach out to me. He withdrew an elegant card from his pocket and placed it on the table. Dorothy picked it up with curiosity, immediately noting the exceptional quality of the paper and the refined typography. The card simply read, J. Rothschild, correspondence through Rothschild & Associates, Fleet Street, London. Rothschild? Dorothy looked up, surprised. I thought your surname was... It's an adapted version, he said quickly, but Dorothy noticed the discomfort in his expression. For business purposes. Another evasion, but this time Dorothy decided not to press. If John, or whoever he truly was, felt the need to keep aspects of his identity secret, she would respect that. After all, her gratitude for the days of genuine companionship outweighed any curiosity about his secrets. Throughout the morning, John insisted on helping her one last time with household chores. They worked side by side in the small garden, removing weeds and preparing the plants for the approaching winter. Dorothy tried to memorize every detail, the way he focused on the work, the care with which he treated even the humblest plants, the instinctive courtesy with which he always made sure she wasn't carrying too much weight. I will miss you, she said impulsively, then immediately blushed for having verbalized such a personal thought. John stopped working and looked directly at her. And I will miss you too, more than you can imagine. There was something in his eyes, an intensity that went beyond simple gratitude, that made Dorothy's heart quicken. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, the feelings she had developed were not entirely one-sided. But then John looked away, and the moment passed, leaving Dorothy questioning if she had imagined the depth of what she saw in his expression. In the afternoon, an elegant carriage stopped in front of the small house. Dorothy watched from the window as a uniformed coachman alighted and waited respectfully. The quality of the carriage, the impeccable varnish, the golden details, the clearly well-bred horses, confirmed her growing suspicions about John's true social standing. Your carriage has arrived, she said, trying to keep her voice casual. John nodded, his expression suddenly becoming formal, as if he were preparing to resume a role he had temporarily abandoned. Dorothy, he said, coming closer to her, there is something I need to tell you before I leave. She looked at him expectantly, noticing that he seemed to be wrestling with some significant internal decision. During these days, I have observed not only your kindness, but also your strength, your independence, your integrity. These are rare and precious qualities. He paused, as if carefully weighing his next words. If circumstances were different, if I were a different man. He did not finish the sentence, but Dorothy understood the implication. Her heart filled simultaneously with joy and sadness, joy at knowing her feelings had found some echo, sadness at the implicit impossibility of the situation. I understand, she said softly. And I thank you for your honesty. John withdrew a small leather purse from his pocket. Please do not protest immediately. This is neither charity nor payment. It is a gift from someone who deeply admires you and wishes for you to have a few small luxuries during the winter months. Dorothy hesitated, but something in his expression, a vulnerability he rarely let show, prevented her from refusing immediately. It is enough money for a few small pleasures, he continued. Books, perhaps, or fabrics for new clothes. Things a woman of your intelligence and refinement deserves to have. John, please." His voice was almost pleading. "Allow me to leave, knowing that I have made at least a small difference in your life, just as you have made an immense difference in mine." Dorothy accepted the purse with trembling hands, touched by the evident sincerity of his words. They walked together to the door, where John turned for a last look at the small house that had been his refuge during crucial days of recovery. "Will you take care of yourself?" he asked. "As I always do. And if you need anything, I have your card." John nodded, but remained standing, as if wrestling with the reluctance to leave. Finally, he leaned in and gently kissed Dorothy's forehead, a chaste gesture, yet laden with genuine tenderness. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." Dorothy watched from the doorway as he made his way to the carriage. The coachman opened the door respectfully, and John climbed in with an agility that confirmed his full recovery. As the carriage began to pull away, John lowered the window and waved. Dorothy waved back, keeping her arm raised until the carriage completely disappeared around the bend in the road. Only then did she allow the suppressed tears to finally stream freely down her face. That night, sitting alone by the fireplace John had lit that morning, Dorothy reflected on the extraordinary events of the previous week. Her life had been temporarily touched by the presence of a man who clearly belonged to a world very different from her own, but who had demonstrated genuine character and kindness. She opened the purse he had left and found a generous sum, along with a brief note, "For the bravest and kindest woman I have ever known. May your life be blessed with all the happiness you deserve." Dorothy carefully put away the card and the note, sensing that, although John had physically departed, the influence of his presence in her life was only just beginning to unfold. 3 weeks passed since John's departure, and Dorothy had established a new routine that, although functioning adequately, carried the constant weight of an absence she felt in every corner of the small house. The repairs he had arranged made a noticeable difference. The roof no longer leaked, the windows closed properly, and the back door had been replaced with a more robust version that better protected her from the cold November winds. With the money John had left, Dorothy had allowed herself a few small luxuries that subtly transformed her existence. She had bought 2 books of poetry, an extravagance she had never before allowed herself, and enough fabric to make a new dress for winter. She had also acquired superior quality tea and some spices that made her simple meals more flavorful. But it was the nights that proved most challenging. Without John's company, without his stimulating conversations and comforting presence, Dorothy found herself confronted with a deeper loneliness than she had experienced even before meeting him. It was as if his brief presence had awakened in her an acute awareness of what her life could be with genuine companionship. On this particular December morning, Dorothy was working near the river when she spotted an elegant carriage approaching on the main road. Her heart momentarily quickened. Could it be possible that John had returned? But she quickly recognized that the vehicle was different from the carriage that had taken him away. The carriage stopped near where she was washing clothes, and from it stepped a middle-aged man dressed in exceptional quality garments. His posture was erect, his movements precise, and there was something in his presence that suggested authority and significant social importance. "Miss Dorothy Whitmore?" he asked, approaching with formal courtesy. "Yes." "Sir," Dorothy dried her hands on her apron, suddenly feeling conscious of her simple appearance in contrast to the visitor's evident elegance. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Reginald Hammond, solicitor for the firm Hammond & Associates of London." He inclined his head slightly. "I have come at the request of a client who wishes to remain anonymous for the moment." Dorothy felt a mix of curiosity and apprehension. What kind of legal matter could involve her? "How may I help you, Mr. Hammond?" "Indeed, miss, I believe it is I who can help you. My client has instructed me to make you a proposition that may significantly interest you." He looked around, noting the modest surroundings. "Perhaps we could discuss this in your residence. The matter requires a certain privacy." Intrigued and slightly nervous, Dorothy led the solicitor to her home. He discreetly observed the recent repairs with evident approval. Though he made no comments, seated at the small table, Hammond withdrew a series of elegantly prepared documents from his leather brief. "My client," he began, "was impressed by your kindness and competence during a recent period when he required assistance. As a result, he would like to offer you a position at his country estate in Sussex." Dorothy blinked, surprised. "A position, sir?" "House manager for a considerable estate. The salary would be substantial, more than you could earn in many years of your current work. Furthermore, you would have comfortable accommodations, assured meals, and a position of responsibility and respect." Dorothy felt her mind reeling. The offer seemed surreal, especially coming from someone claiming to represent an anonymous client. "May I ask why your client would make such an offer to someone he doesn't properly know?" Hammond smiled slightly. "My client possesses reliable sources of information regarding your character and competence. He rarely errs in his assessments of people." There was something familiar in the way Hammond spoke of his client, a deference that went beyond a simple professional relationship. Dorothy began to suspect who might be behind the offer. "This client, has he met me personally?" "I believe so, though the exact circumstances of your encounter are not within my purview to discuss." Dorothy nodded, her suspicions confirmed. John, or whoever he truly was behind this extraordinary offer. Would the position require me to leave Bath permanently? Initially, yes, but there would be periods of leave during which you could visit family or locations of your preference. And naturally, if the position did not prove suitable after a probationary period, you would be free to leave with generous compensation. Dorothy stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the river where she had found John injured. The life Hammond described was tempting: financial security, a respectable position, an escape from the constant uncertainty of her current existence. "May I have some time to consider the offer?" "Naturally. My client understands that it is a significant decision." Hammond also stood, preparing to leave. However, he hoped for a response within a week, if possible. The position needs to be filled before the start of the new year. After the solicitor's departure, Dorothy spent the rest of the day in a state of mental agitation. The offer represented an extraordinary opportunity, but it also meant leaving behind the only life she had ever known, the only place she could call home. Even more disturbing was the growing certainty that John was orchestrating her life from afar. On one hand, she felt touched by his continued interest in her well-being. On the other, she questioned whether accepting the position wouldn't, in a way, be accepting an elaborate version of charity. Over the following days, Dorothy carefully weighed the pros and cons of the decision. She spoke discreetly with some older neighbors, without revealing specific details of the offer, but seeking perspectives on significant life changes. It was one afternoon, while folding clean clothes, that Dorothy had a sudden revelation. She remembered John's words about courage, how he had admired her ability to face uncertainty with determination. Perhaps accepting the position was not accepting charity, but rather demonstrating the same courage he had praised. Moreover, there was a growing curiosity about who John truly was. The position in Sussex could offer opportunities to discover more about the man who had impacted her life so deeply. On the morning of the 4th day, Dorothy made her decision. She wrote a careful letter to Mr. Hammond, accepting the position and inquiring about travel arrangements and specific expectations of her responsibilities. The reply arrived surprisingly quickly, just 2 days later. Hammond informed her that a carriage would be sent to collect her the following week, and that her first responsibilities would involve overseeing preparations for a significant social gathering the owner planned to host during the year-end festivities. "A social gathering," Dorothy murmured, rereading the letter. What kind of social standing did her mysterious benefactor occupy to host events requiring elaborate preparations? She spent her last days in Bath organizing her few belongings and making arrangements for neighbors to care for her chickens. She sold some furniture she couldn't take, but carefully kept items with sentimental value, including the card John had left and the note that had accompanied the money. On the eve of her departure, Dorothy walked one last time to the river where she had found John. The place seemed different now, laden with memories and meaning it hadn't possessed before that fateful October day. "Wherever this takes me," she whispered to the flowing waters. "Thank you for teaching me that life can change in unexpected ways." On the morning of her departure, an even more elegant carriage than Hammond's stopped in front of her house. The coachman, a man of distinguished appearance wearing immaculate livery, respectfully carried her limited luggage. "Miss Whitmore?" he asked, touching his hat. "I am Peterson at your service. The master instructed me to ensure you have a comfortable journey." During the several-hour journey through the English winter landscape, Dorothy observed the gradual transition from familiar fields to unknown territories. The carriage was luxurious beyond her previous experience, with velvet-upholstered seats and small amenities that suggested the owner was accustomed to traveling in considerable comfort. When they finally arrived at the estate in Sussex, Dorothy could barely contain her surprise. The mansion that rose before her was grander and more imposing than any structure she had personally seen. It was not merely a prosperous country house, it was an aristocratic estate of significant proportions. "Good heavens," she murmured, observing the elegant turrets, the formal gardens and the rows of windows that reflected the late afternoon sun. Peterson noticed her reaction with a gentle smile. "Impressive, isn't it, miss? Belmont House has been the family residence for over 200 years. The family?" Dorothy turned to him, confused. "I thought I would be working for a merchant or industrialist." "Oh, no, miss. The master is—" Peterson stopped abruptly as if realizing he had said too much. "Well, he will explain his position to you himself, properly." As the carriage approached the main entrance, Dorothy felt a mix of excitement and terror. She had accepted a position that clearly went far beyond what she had imagined, but it was too late to reconsider. Her old life had been left behind, and all that remained was to bravely face what awaited her. When the massive doors of the mansion swung open, revealing an interior of dazzling elegance, Dorothy took a deep breath and prepared to finally discover the truth about the man she had saved, and who, apparently, was now determined to transform her life in ways she never could have anticipated. The massive oak doors of Belmont House swung open with a solemn echo that reverberated through the imposing grand hall. Dorothy remained motionless for an instant, contemplating the interior that surpassed in grandeur even her most ambitious dreams. The vaulted ceiling rose to impressive heights, adorned with elaborate frescoes depicting pastoral and mythological scenes. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations, reflecting the golden light that filtered through the tall windows. "Miss Whitmore," a familiar voice said from behind her, laden with a formality that couldn't entirely disguise a note of nervousness. Dorothy turned slowly, her heart quickening as she instantly recognized the elegant silhouette emerging from the shadows of the side corridor. But the man approaching was simultaneously familiar and completely transformed. Where John had worn simple patched clothes, this figure wore an outfit of exceptional quality, a navy velvet coat with golden embroidery, a cream silk waistcoat, and a posture that radiated natural authority. "John?" she whispered, her voice almost inaudible in the vast space. "In truth," he said, stopping a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested both elegance and anxiety. "My full name is Jonathan Rothschild. Baronet of Belmont, to be entirely precise." Dorothy felt the ground seem to sway beneath her feet. Rothschild, the name on the card he had left. But he wasn't simply a prosperous merchant as she had imagined. He was legitimate aristocracy, owner of one of the most impressive estates she had ever seen. "You lied to me," she said, her voice gaining strength as the reality of the situation settled in. "I omitted details," Jonathan corrected, taking a cautious step towards her. "But my feelings, my gratitude, my admiration for you were entirely genuine." Dorothy recoiled instinctively, her mind processing the implications of the revelation. "Why? Why hide who you truly were?" Jonathan sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair in a way she recognized from their days in her small home. "Because I wanted to know your true nature. For years I've been surrounded by people who see me only as a title, wealth, useful social connections. When you found me on that bank, injured and vulnerable, I finally had the opportunity to be judged by my character, not my position. So I was an experiment?" The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. "A way to test human kindness? No." Jonathan moved closer quickly, his formal composure crumbling. Dorothy, please understand. Initially, yes, there was curiosity about how I would be treated without the trappings of my position. But from the very first day, from the moment you nursed me with such dedication, it became far more than simple curiosity. Dorothy crossed her arms, trying to maintain emotional distance, despite the evident sincerity in his voice. Far more like what? I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, laden with a vulnerability that contrasted starkly with the formal surroundings. Dorothy felt her heart quicken, but forced herself to maintain rationality. Did you fall in love with the humble washerwoman who tended your wounds? Or with the romantic idea of kindness that I represented? Jonathan moved closer still, his intense blue eyes fixed on hers. I fell in love with a woman who showed courage when she was terrified, generosity when she possessed little, and dignity in all circumstances. I fell in love with Dorothy Whitmore, not with any idealized version of her. Dorothy felt her resolve waver before the sincerity of his words, but practical questions continued to haunt her. And what does that mean, Jonathan? I am an orphaned washerwoman. You are a baronet. We live in completely different worlds. Worlds can be brought closer, he said softly. If both people are willing, how? By making me your housekeeper? Keeping me close but in an appropriately subordinate position? Jonathan seemed genuinely shocked. Dorothy, no. The position of housekeeper was merely a way to bring you here without creating immediate social scandal. But that is not what I desire for us. Then what do you desire? Jonathan took a deep breath, as if preparing to leap from a cliff. I desire to court you properly. I desire for you to know my world, to see if you could find happiness within it. And if you can, I desire to ask for your hand in marriage. Dorothy felt as if the air had been sucked from her lungs. Marriage? Jonathan, be realistic. Your family, your friends, society would never accept such a union. I have no immediate family. I am the last of the Rothschilds of Belmont. As for friends and society, he shrugged with an elegance that was purely aristocratic. I discovered during our week together that their opinion matters far less than I imagined. Dorothy walked to one of the tall windows, observing the formal gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. The estate was stunning, but it represented a world so distant from her origins that it seemed almost fictional. How can I know this isn't merely romantic gratitude, or guilt for having deceived me about your identity? Jonathan approached from behind, his presence warm even without touching her. Because during these 3 weeks since I left your home, I could think of nothing but you. Because I hired discreet investigators to ensure you were safe and well. Because every morning I wake up wishing I was sharing the simple breakfast in your small kitchen, instead of dining alone in a dining room that could seat 30. Dorothy turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same intensity she had noticed during his days of recovery. What if I cannot adapt to this world? What if I prove an embarrassment to you? Impossible, Jonathan said with absolute conviction. You possess natural grace, keen intelligence, and genuine kindness. These are qualities that cannot be taught, but which render all other social skills merely superficial. I do not know how to waltz or make elegant conversation. Those can be learned. But courage, generosity, integrity, these you already possess in abundance. Dorothy remained silent for a long moment, her gaze flickering between Jonathan's sincere face and the magnificence of the surroundings. Finally, she said, if I were to agree to try, what would be the next step? The relief in Jonathan's expression was unmistakable. You would spend the next few weeks here, getting to know the estate, learning about my responsibilities, allowing me to court you properly. There would be ample time to decide if this world could become your home. And if I decide I cannot, then I will escort you back to Bath with eternal gratitude for the time you granted me, and I will provide a sum that will ensure your comfort for the rest of your life. Dorothy nodded slowly. The offer was generous beyond her wildest dreams, but there was something more important than practical considerations. During her weeks alone after his departure, she had come to realize that her feelings for Jonathan, or John, as she had known him, were deeper than she had initially admitted. Very well, she said finally. I agree to stay and see if we can build something true between such different worlds. The smile that lit Jonathan's face was radiant. He stepped closer and, with respectful hesitation, took her hands in his. "Dorothy," he said softly, "I promise that every day will be your choice. You will never feel imprisoned by gratitude or circumstances." In the days that followed, Dorothy began to explore both the estate and the complexities of her new situation. Jonathan demonstrated infinite patience, gradually introducing her to the social expectations of his position without ever making her feel inadequate. He discreetly hired a companion, Mrs. Pemberton, an elegant and gentle widow, to assist Dorothy with matters of etiquette and dress. He arranged dancing lessons with a local master, but always in a way that seemed natural and enjoyable, rather than obligatory. More importantly, they spent hours conversing in the gardens or the library, exploring thoughts and dreams with the same intimacy they had developed in her small home. Dorothy discovered that Jonathan, far from being the superficial aristocrat she had feared, was a man of considerable intelligence and genuine social conscience. "I manage not only this estate, but several others on behalf of families requiring assistance," he explained one afternoon as they walked through the gardens. "A significant portion of my income is dedicated to orphanages and schools for poor children. Is that why you knew so much about household work and practical management?" "Precisely. I cannot manage estates effectively without understanding every aspect of their operation." As December progressed, Dorothy felt gradually more comfortable in her new environment. Her new dresses were elegant but not overly ornate. Her manners were refining naturally, and she had developed genuine relationships with several members of the household staff. On Christmas Eve, as they prepared for a small celebration with the estate's employees, Jonathan asked to speak with her privately in the library. "Dorothy," he said, his voice laden with a nervousness she hadn't perceived since his first days of recovery, "these weeks have confirmed everything I hoped. You have adapted to this world while keeping your essential identity intact. More importantly, my love for you has only grown." He knelt before the chair where she was seated, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. "Dorothy Whitmore, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Dorothy looked at the ring, a solitaire diamond of simple elegance, encircled by small emeralds that caught the firelight, and then at the man who had transformed her life in ways she could never have imagined. "Yes," she whispered, extending a trembling hand. "Yes, Jonathan, I accept," as he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to kiss her softly. Dorothy knew she had found something rare and precious, true love that transcended social barriers, built upon a solid foundation of mutual respect, genuine admiration, and the courage of both to embrace an uncertain future together. Outside, snow began to fall softly over the gardens of Belmont House, covering the world with a pristine purity that mirrored the new beginning awaiting them.